Hello, and welcome back to the Kings Weekly Podcast, part of the Believe Network, the Basketball Intelligence Network, and the Old Man Squad Network. I am your co-host, Nick Agar Johnson, editor-in-chief and staff writer for No Ceilings NBA, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, the founder and curator of the Basketball Intelligence newsletter, available at basketballintelligence.net, Ray LeBeau. Hello there, Ray.
Hello, Nick, and hello to all of our listeners. Thank you for joining us today.
So, probably most of you will have noticed that we've been on a little bit of a hiatus due to a combination of logistics and medical issues, but back and healthy as we're going to get here for today. So we have a little bit of a mini series that we're kicking off today. And, now that we're in the throes of the very end of the season, we wanted to focus more on the real highlight of the season for the Sacramento Kings, and that is the rookie class for the Kings this year. So we're going to run in order from where they were selected or not selected in the 2025 NBA draft. And so the first player on that list, of course, is Nique Clifford, who the Kings traded for his draft rights with the Oklahoma City Thunder on draft night in exchange for a future first round pick. And stepping up into the first round to get Nique Clifford at 24 was something that I was far from the only draft analyst who was a huge fan of that move for the Kings. On the season, there has been, in my mind anyway, a lot more to like about what we've seen from Nique Clifford than there have been issues, although certainly been an up and down year for him, in addition to, the mostly down year that it's been for the Kings overall. Just a little bit of a brief overview before we start to get into some more of the nitty gritty. Clifford has played in 69 games for the Kings so far and started 22 of them. Likely to clear that 70 game threshold before we hit the end of the year, almost guaranteed to do so. Just shy of 8 points a game, just shy of 4 rebounds a game, and just over 2 assists per game, in addition to a steal and the third of a block per game in 24 minutes. Shooting splits 41, 33, 69 from the free throw line. And I do want to dive into some more of the shooting stuff in a bit, because that I think is a lot more complicated of a story than just the basic shooting splits that I've read off. But those are sort of the baseline stuff for Clifford, who was drafted out of Colorado State as a senior. He's one of the older rookies in the league, and that's certainly something that has shown in a good way in terms of the maturity of his game. But Ray, I've given enough of an intro here. What are your thoughts on what we've seen from Nique Clifford with the Kings this year?
Well, I'd like to preface this with a more general discussion that indicates in part why we're doing this. And whatever anybody might think, and I would say it's almost exclusively extraordinarily negative about decisions that Kings management, coach at any level has made this year, I think there's one thing that really sticks out positively, and that is player evaluation slash scouting. And they've really done a good job with that. I think not only in the players that we're going to be talking about today, but we can also throw Precious Achiuwa into that, who is a player that no one else wanted. So I think kudos to the Kings in that regard. So starting off with Clifford, I agree with you, Nick, that that was a very good pick. What has impressed me so far, among other things, and various elements of his game, is his basketball IQ and his versatility. Just to start with those, I think are definitely in the significantly plus category. So back to you to get more granular about his game.
Yeah, it's interesting because you and I, and I'm sure we will again on spoiler alert, our next episode, but you and I have talked plenty about how impressed we were with Maxime Reynaud when we saw him in person in Las Vegas for Summer League. But Nique Clifford was actually the one who was named to the all tournament first team in Summer League. And that was because he did basically everything for that team. With, Devin Carter did have some ball handling slash point guard responsibilities, but a whole lot of that ended up on Nique Clifford's shoulders. And it was one of those things where, yeah, okay, he was 23 years old at the time, which interestingly for Summer League, is right in that weird middle range where most players aren't, because Summer League is a whole lot of guys who are like 28, 29 trying to get jobs in professional leagues overseas. And then, obviously all the 19-year-olds who are just taken in the first round of the draft. And so it was not entirely unexpected that Clifford would be as dominant of a force in Summer League as he was, but, it was still nice to see. And part of that, I think, is also that he shot 46% from 3 point range in Summer League. And, I sort of hinted at it earlier, but in terms of the ups and downs he's had this season, really the sort of biggest one in terms of both being the most noticeable and also being the most complained about among Kings fans is his shooting inconsistency. And that's one of those things where, again, he had a much different college career in his second stop at Colorado State than he did in his first few years at Colorado. But, by his last 2 years at Colorado State, he shot 38% on a quite healthy volume of 3 point attempts. And to start the year, it was not quite as pretty for Clifford in the shooting department, but that was one of those skills that it seemed much more like something that would translate rather than, oh, this guy's not actually a capable shooter. And sure enough, pre All Star break, he was just under 32% from 3 point range. Post All Star break, he's 35% for 3 point range. We can and will and have, etc., talked about how the brand of basketball played in the NBA in March and, early April pre-playoff time is a little bit different than it is the rest of the year. But in terms of your shots going down, it's, that is something that is a lot more, in my mind anyway, stable than, oh, this guy's averaging 20 and 10, right? It's not that as much as the solid looks that he was taking are finally falling for him in a way that, again, I would be surprised if next season his percentage is closer to that 32% to start the year than the 35% clip he's on finishing the year. But the shooting is much more of an ancillary skill for him. I mean, obviously the big thing with Clifford is, you mentioned the versatility, and that's the key word, but really for me more than anything else, it's the defensive versatility. I mean, he's listed at 6'5", 175. If I'm being honest, I think the 6'5" part might be a little bit generous. Even still, he was a wildly gifted rebounder at Colorado State, and that has continued in the NBA in a way that, even though he was also a similarly outlier rebounder in college for a guard, it hasn't quite translated for Devin Carter in the same incredibly active way that it has for Nique Clifford. Carter's still a good rebounder. I don't want to denigrate him here, but Clifford really showed that he can do a lot of things on the margins that you aren't typically getting out of two guards. And he spent a lot of time at the three. Part of that is just because the Kings have 7 combo guards and, one small forward in Keegan Murray, which, leads to some interesting lineup constructions. But again, I've said this on so many different podcasts for so many different platforms, and I do it because it's important to repeat. Pretty much all rookies at the NBA level are between bad and awful on defense. And it's a rare moment when someone crosses that threshold as a rookie and becomes, oh, this guy's actually average, maybe even plus on the defensive end. And it's funny because one of those guys who became a solid defender pretty early on was Davion Mitchell, and someone who did not was Keegan Murray. And, I've talked the Keegan Murray development on the defensive end to death at this point. But again, for someone who now is, cementing himself as a borderline all defensive team member, Keegan had not figured it out on the defensive end until there were some signs late in the year, but certainly the first half of the season, he was just absolutely lost on that end of the floor. And he made up for it by breaking the rookie record for 3 point makes, which now has been eclipsed by Con Knipple. But Keegan did hold that. That'll always be something that he had in his trophy case. But Clifford was much more ready, much faster on that end. He, it's easy to see in the rebounding numbers, but it's true across the board. He makes up for relative lack of size. And, I mentioned the 175, right? Like relative lack of heft as well by just being incredibly competitive on the defensive end of the floor. So, the shooting inconsistency, it's not great. I am not going to pretend that I'm not worried about the fact that despite his 3-point percentage ticking up dramatically after the All-Star break, his free throw percentage has gone in the opposite direction, which, again, I've talked before about how sample size issues often mean that free throw shooting is a better indicator of 3-point shooting just because the sample size differences. With Clifford, he's taken so many more threes than free throws that it slightly goes in the other direction. But, he's taken 19 free throws since the All-Star break. That's not enough of a sample size to really say all that much. But ultimately, I thought that Clifford was a better shooter than, he was sub 30% from three at one point, and obviously he's ticked back up over that, especially since the All-Star break. I think that there is a lot to like about his future, especially defensively. The offense, it's more consistency, I think, than anything else.
Well, Nick, I want to ask you a question in that regard. It strikes me, you've heard me say many times, and I used to say content is king, as everybody used to say. But for a long time now, I've been saying context is king. And, the context of being a rookie who whose playing time and playing circumstance and everything else you want to say about that collection of things was so at variance and so inconsistent. To me, very often leads to a difficulty in shooting at the level that one would have expected. So hope, but I think expected. And to me, I don't read anything into it, and maybe I'm overreacting in the sense that once it takes getting consistent time in a consistent way with a consistent role that's being articulated for you before various aspects of your game come together at the level that one would hope. It's not just shooting, but I think shooting can be one that's significantly affected by that. And I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
So I have a very granular thought to start with, and then a much more sort of general take on it, which is it is very interesting to me that you brought up specifically the notion of role, because in the month of March, there was exactly one game when Nique Clifford came off the bench. It was by far his worst game in the month of March, purely in terms of the shooting. 1 of 11 shooting against the Hawks a couple nights ago. And the one make was from 3-point range, but he went 1 of 6 from three. And again, that was the one game where he came off the bench. Other than that, he only had 2 games in the month of March where he wasn't in. Oh no, excuse me, 3 games where he wasn't in double figures scoring. And so that's a very, again, we've talked all the time about how single game sample sizes really don't tell all that much, but it does track very neatly with your theory that that was the one game where he couldn't find the basket. The flip side is the much more general take that is a phrase that is constantly thrown around at No Ceilings, specifically in terms of scouting, but especially for rookies, it's scouting just up another level until a player's more established than not even done with their rookie year yet. But and I believe Tyler Rucker was the first I heard say this at No Ceilings, so credit to him, and apologies if I'm misremembering who said that originally. But the idea of what do you do when your shot's not falling? What do you do to help the team win when you can't buy a bucket? And in that game, yeah, he went 1 of 11 for 3 points. He also had 5 assists. He got 4 rebounds in 23 minutes, had a block shot, only turned the ball over twice. So, and played quite solid defense, especially for a rookie. Beyond just the block shot. He also didn't foul once, right? So again, it's like, okay, sometimes you can't control whether the shots go in or not. I've brought it up on this year podcast before that even Bruce Bowen had a year where he shot like 32% from 3-point range. And that's a whole season, right? Especially on a game to game level, sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't, right? Even among the most ridiculously skilled shooters in the world, even Steph Curry doesn't hit 100% of his threes, right? Some nights
Well,
they're
that
just,
was a 12 for 13 game.
well, not 17 for 17, right? That's, again, it's what do you do to help the team out when you can't make a shot? And, he was still spacing the floor, right? It's not like he was just, it's not like teams were playing 4-on-5 because he was refusing to shoot. But when the shots weren't going in, he focused in much more on his playmaking. He focused in much more on his defense. And, he didn't make really any mistakes. I mean, yeah, he had a couple turnovers, but they weren't egregious, right? And it's like, what do you do when even beyond just 3-point shots not falling, right? It's like when it's not working out in one area of the game, are you a one trick pony who, if your shot's not falling, or if you're making bad passes when you're like a Rajon Rondo type of like pass first, second, and third point guard, what do you do that's helping the team? And the answer with Clifford is he's already well advanced beyond your usual level of rookie defense. And he's also, you know, among the better playmakers of the combo guard wing types on the Kings roster. And he went through with that. And sure enough, next night against the Brooklyn Nets, he had 17. He made 8 of his 14 shots. He, had a few turnovers, but also grabbed 7 rebounds, right? It's like he had a much better game. And, going back to my previous point, it helped that he started in that game like he had all month up until that Hawks game. But, even still, it's like if you are only focused on the inconsistencies, which I do think is an important point. I do think we need to talk about it because him swinging from 3 points to 17 points has not been an uncommon experience with him this season. But the things that he can do and does do consistently are put in that effort on the defensive end of the floor, limit his mistakes, and be part of a scheme in a valuable way. So again, the inconsistencies we do need to talk about, but the flip side of that also is it's a lot easier to be an inconsistent offensive player when you're a consistent defensive player, and he fits in.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, I also think very strongly, not just in his circumstance, but generally, if your role fluctuates so much that different things are expected of you from game to game, um, and you're being played different amount of minutes in game to game, it not necessarily shakes your confidence, but it gets you out of the regularity of the flow that will maximize your shooting. And so I that's my view of a lot of young players that are just sort of feeling their way in part because of how they're being used, not necessarily that they're being used wrongly given the context that they're in. Sometimes definitely yes, but it just to me, I'd like to judge somebody's, you know, dismissing the obvious people whose shots are broken and that kind of thing. But it's like, okay, they've got to get their feet under them. They've got to understand. They've got to get a more consistent flow for that likely to be reflected at the closer to the max of where they're going to be. Anyway, that's my observation.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there are unfortunately a couple of examples that break the rule that I was trying to figure out here, but some I mean, honestly, his best game of the season and a few other of his better games this season have been the games that he started after coming off the bench in the previous game. Like his season high was 30 against Cleveland on February 7th, and previous game, he'd come off the bench. I just brought up the stinker he had against the Hawks coming off the bench, and then the next game he had 17 and 7 against the Nets. Again, there are a couple of examples that break this rule. Like on my birthday last year, December 11th, he started after coming off the bench in the previous game, and he went 1 for 8 and had 4
But
turnovers.
can you imagine how nervous he was knowing that that was your birthday?
I really genuinely don't know how to respond to that. I mean, I doubt it for a whole bunch of different reasons, but no, I mean, again, the consistency thing, the fact that he's had multiple of the top 5 best games from him this year were games where he started after coming off the bench in the previous game, there's certainly something to be said for, him maybe being, maybe having a more consistent role would have been helpful for some of the inconsistency concerns. And certainly the fact that he reeled off four nearly 20-point games to start the year as a starter, and then had two poor games in a row. 7 points on 8 shots against the Raptor. Oh no, wait, that's summer league. My bad. I am reading the wrong part of the calendar here. That is entirely my fault. But no, I mean the other games that I mentioned, by the way, I can guarantee were regular season, especially since one of them was in February. But moving on from that little snafu on my end, again, there is something to be said for the fact that some of his best games of the year were games where he knew he was starting after previously coming off the bench. There is something to be said for the fact that he's been much more consistent from 3-point range since the All-Star break, but it still hasn't been perfect. Like, just as an example, here are his last 5 games from 3-point range: 1 of 4, 1 of 6, 2 of 2, 3 of 4, 1 of 5. Which, spoiler alert, if you look in the game logs for a lot of players, you'll see, some inconsistent 3-point numbers in there. But with Clifford, again, a lot of it is just that he is someone who, again, has and will continue to put double-digit efficient scoring games back to back against, like, those 2 points on 1 of 8 or 2 points on 1 of 7 or 3 points on 1 of 11 kind of nights. And that's something that is more concerning for me than the rest of his offensive profile, just because in theory, that's one of the benefits of drafting an older player. And, there is always the jump from non-NBA league to NBA league, that it doesn't matter how old or young you are, it's going to be a difficult translation for anybody. But especially with Clifford, it's, again, because he's the kind of defensive piece that he is, it's not as vital that, like, he's not carrying an offense's scoring load, right? It's not like, just as an example, right? Back when De'Aaron Fox was on the Kings, if he had a night where he had 3 points, that's a lot more concerning than a night where Nique Clifford has 3 points. So it does, in a way, kind of put a cap on his ceiling as a scorer if you can't figure out the consistency. But I just keep going back to how he contributes on nights when his shot isn't falling.
I would say this in response to that his defense is so good, and his offense, even with those inconsistencies, is good, that he's established, as far as I'm concerned, that he certainly has the potential to be a quite serious rotation player. And wow, I mean, if the Kings are drafting quite serious rotation players consistently, they're going to get a lot better.
Tyler Rucker did a wonderful piece at No Ceilings a few months ago at this point, breaking down, and this was actually for, might have been a couple drafts ago, actually, now that I think about it, because I think it was before the 2024 draft, of how people were talking about, oh, this is a historically terrible draft, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, every single draft class since 2000 has produced at least 3 All-Stars. But really, the depth of Rucker's piece was like, at least 3 All-Stars, but pretty consistently and reliably 12 to 15 players who have decade-long NBA careers. And, I'm stepping on my own tail a little bit, given how the vast majority of my work at this point is in terms of the NBA draft. But I think people really tend to overestimate the success rate of picks outside of the top 5. And so you saying, yeah, I think he's established himself as a clear rotation player, by the time you get to the 24th pick, there are usually only, between 5 and 7 guys taken from that point forward that have decade-long NBA careers in any context, right? And, it's the kind of thing where I've been thinking about him a lot because he's, I think, a pretty good prospect chemistry slash shades of guy for the prospect I'm writing my next article on for No Ceilings, but I've been thinking a lot about Chris Dunn lately. And Chris Dunn was the fifth pick, right? Very different echelon than the 24th pick. And it looked very likely that Chris Dunn was going to flame out earlier in his career because, he was asked to be a starting point guard and he wasn't quite a starting point guard. At this point, he has now had a 10-year NBA career. He's been on the short list of conversations for all defensive teams for a number of years now. And if you were to look back at the historic success rate of fifth overall picks, 2-3 years into his career, it would have been, this guy's an absolute bust, right? At this point, now that he's established himself as a decades-long player who's, flipped between starting and coming off the bench, depending on the team, and played a pretty significant role on, basically every team he's been on for the last 5 years, that's probably, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but that's pretty close to middle of the road for the fifth overall pick. If you get that kind of player at 24, and again, I don't think Nique Clifford is in the same level of all defense discussions that Chris Dunn is, and it would be great if he gets there, but he does have to get there. But the point being, I think people just see first round pick and it's like, oh, he's not a starter, he's a bust. Like, no,
It
that's
doesn't
not how it
even make
works
any
at
sense
all.
to lump together all first round players as they're all in the first round. So you're telling me who goes at 30 this year? Not you're telling me. Whoever's saying that is telling me whoever goes at 30 is going to be as good as Cameron Boozer or Devonsa or any of the other players at the top. That doesn't make any sense. The only thing they have in common in the draft is that they went in the same round.
Yeah, I obsessed over these numbers for quite a while when I was first starting to get into draft coverage of the number one overall pick historically has about a 60% chance of being an all-star at some point in their career. Immediately after that, the chances of a player taken at that pick being a star drops off an absolute cliff. Like, just because of the vagaries of the last 25 years of the draft, number 3 picks had actually had more success than number 2 picks, which honestly, a lot of that was driven by Darko Milicic and a few other number 2 picks who didn't pan out at the NBA level. But the drop off was steeper from number 1 to number 2 than anything else, and then the drop off from 5th pick to the rest of the first round was pretty steep. And then once you got past like the lottery range, again, there are about 12 to 15 sort of long-term NBA players in every draft. And almost always, at least half of them are the first 15 picks, right? So,
So I guess it's
yeah,
fair to say that at number 24, it is highly unlikely and rare, unusual, that a team is going to get somebody as good as Cliff.
yeah, the bust rate for picks in that, 21 to 30 range is a lot higher than people think it is. And it's one of those things where, again, would it be nice if the Kings had managed to get a multi-time All-Star at 24? Yeah, sure. That'd be fantastic. But, it'd also be
Draymond
fantastic.
Greens and the Jokic's, obviously second rounders, but dismiss those from your thoughts, everybody. That doesn't happen very often. The
I
reason
mean,
it so stands out is because it doesn't happen very often.
I have talked before, and I know that I will talk again about how Isaiah Thomas is my favorite player of all time. He is the sole 60th overall pick who's had any sort of accolades in any capacity, and vast majority of those guys never play in the NBA at all, right? And there are a number of players picked around Nique Clifford who have had much less success in their rookie years and shown much less in terms
Absolutely.
of what they might be producing going forward. And so if you are only judging Nique Clifford by the fact of, oh, well, Hugo Gonzalez has had a better year, it's like, A, he's playing for a much better team. And B, it's like, okay, so you're talking about him, but you're not talking about Ben Saraf, who until the last month had barely played outside of the G League. You're not talking about Jace Richardson, who, not quite the same situation, but a similar sort of deal of, not exactly being a major player for a team that is in trouble in Orlando, right? It's like if you're only judging, whoever you picked at 24 by like, well, Draymond Green was taken 11 picks later. It's like, yeah, okay. Congratulations. You played roulette 70 times and you didn't hit, but
And thankfully,
someone
you
showed
weren't
up at
playing
the
Russian
table.
roulette, right? Thankfully, you weren't playing Russian roulette.
Well, that's a different problem. But it's like if somebody walks up to the roulette table and puts $1 million on 00 and hits, fantastic for them. If you go into a casino every day and put every dime in your savings account on 00, you're going to be in a lot of trouble real quickly. So, entirely judging players based on, oh, well, this guy was drafted in a similar range and was much more successful. If you're doing that with, look, I hate saying this, but I have to. If you're doing that with Marvin Bagley, yes, absolutely reasonable. With the number 2 pick. If you're doing that at 24, you're missing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, and I would question whether Ugo really has had a better year than Nick in the sense that and you kind of alluded to this in a little bit. Um, he's often in situations where a very good game from him might result in a victory. That's not true of Nick. They're not going to win regardless of how well he plays. And also the media attention to the good things that he does that are instrumental in helping to win games is what 100 to 1 compared to what Nick would get on a national level, or Nick would get. So I don't know if it's a really fair comparison, and nothing to denigrate Ugo. I think he's been terrific, but
Oh yeah, no, I was only bringing him up in the sense of I was looking at the 2025 NBA draft and being like, who that was taken after Nique would people potentially be like, oh man, we should have taken that guy? And it's like,
you don't know. I mean, like the people that are saying it, what makes you think because of this selected instances where his play has been so instrumental in winning a game in a very important context, how are you extending that to how he would have done on the Kings or vice versa?
any of the above. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So again, this is part 1 of our 3-part series, which we will be parceling out. But before we wrap up this episode, is there anything else you wanted to bring up?
There's one more thing, which I'll do for each of the 3 shows, but for this one, as many of you know, I assume everybody knows since everybody's listens to every episode, we do a song title for each episode. And this one's a little bit different because the song title we're asking for on this episode is what do you think the Kings' chances are of becoming a serious contender within the next 4 years? And we have to, again, this is not the lyric, it's the song title. So I'm on an Elvis Costello tip right now for these. And my pick for this one is Less Than Zero.
And I thought I was going in a dark direction with mine. So, a little bit of behind the scenes for all of you. Ray came up with his very quickly and prompted me to come up with mine, and I struggled with it a lot more. And I think my weakest pick of the 3 is probably the one that I went with for the first one. But also, like Ray, I attempted to do all 3 from the same artist. And I also picked an artist who I have listened to definitely near the top of the list of artists that I've listened to in honestly my lifetime in Ed Sheeran. And again, I think my weakest pick is my first one, but the one I ended up going with for this was the second song from his album Plus, which is titled, or no, is that one from Multiply? I can't. I think it's either way. The song title is I'm a Mess.
Okay. Well, the next 2 shows will have 2 more song-related things for the show. So if you have no other reason to listen, which I can't believe, at least tune in so you can find out what those are. Okay, we're going to move on to our next rookie in our next show. Okay.
All right, so that will do it for today's episode. Thank you all so much for tuning in. As mentioned up top, we are part of the Believe Network, the Basketball Intelligence Network, and the Old Man Squad Network. You can find Believe on social media at Believe. You can find Basketball Intelligence, basketballintelligence.net, as mentioned, on social media at Ticket Rules. And you can find the Old Man Squad Network at Old Man Squad on social media. If you've been enjoying the show, please be sure to leave a rating and a review in whatever podcast player you might be using. 5 stars, always much appreciated, and subscribe to the show if you haven't yet. We are also, as of recently, on YouTube. So if you want to check us out there as well, leave a like on the videos, subscribe to the channel. Also, always much appreciated. And again, as mentioned, this is part 1 of our 3-part series. So be on the lookout in a few days. We'll have 2 episodes this week, actually. So be on the lookout in a few days for the episode I think most of you are most looking forward to, our Maxime Breno episode. But that'll be out soon. In the meantime, you can follow us on all the platforms mentioned. And if you have any specific feedback regarding the show, feel free to shoot us an email, kingsweeklypodcast@gmail.com. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
Thanks.